Good morning, everyone. So, a couple of years ago, I was living in India, as Robert said, on a Fulbright scholarship. And that spring, two friends and I decided that we were going to take this epic Gandhian-style train trip across the country. So we took this train called the Himsagar Express, all the way from Kanyakumari, which is at the very bottom tip of India, all the way up to Jammu Tawi, which is in the north, near the Himalayas. And it was about 70 hours non-stop on this train over 4 days. And one of the ways Indians pass time on these long train trips is to sing. So they often play this game called Antakshari, which is where one person picks a song and they start singing this song. And everyone joins in with them. And then they reach a certain stopping point in the song. And the next person, it's their turn, and they have to pick a song that begins with the last syllable of the previous song. And then it keeps on going, everyone keeps on singing. And this game can continue for hours and hours, or even days, you know. And sometimes people get off the train, and other people get on, and the people who get on may not know anything about the people they're sitting next to, but they can all play this game because everyone in India knows these same songs, regardless of their class or race or gender. Everyone knows these same songs. So my friends and I decided we were going to try to play our own version of Antakshari, and we ran into a few problems. The first was that 2 out of the 3 of us barely knew any Indian songs. And we also realized it was much more difficult to use English songs than it was to use Indian songs because the way the language is structured, we don't have a lot of overlapping first and last syllables in English. That's the way it is, I guess. But the other reason that it was kind of odd to play this game was that all 3 of us, even though we had extensive musical knowledge, we didn't have the knowledge of the same songs. And we would try to kind of go through and sing these songs quickly because we were afraid that the others would get bored because they didn't know the songs. So it was a kind of funny game of Antakshari. And so as a musician, this made me think a lot about the difference between how Americans and Indians share their musical experiences with one another. And in the West, you know, we choose the music we listen to, and that makes us individuals. That makes us who we are. And we like to share new pieces with other people and make playlists for them, things like that. Whereas in India, the fact that everyone knows the same songs really unites them. So I guess you can imagine from the embarrassingly small amount of Bollywood songs that I contributed to our game of Antakshari that I did not grow up in India, as Robert said. In fact, I grew up here in Los Angeles, in Studio City, as a first-generation American of Indian parents. So my father is a Muslim from Gujarat, which is in the north of India, and his family moved to Pakistan after partition. And my mother is a Catholic from Goa, which is in the south of India, and her family lived in Kenya. So between me and my parents, we speak 10 different languages, even though the only one we actually all 3 have in common is English. So of course I can look back now and see how wild and unique my childhood was, but at the time I think I was subconsciously aware that the culture I shared with my family really didn't have much resonance outside of my home. And the few times, you know, my secret Indian life got mixed up with my public American life, when I maybe got made fun of for mistakenly saying a word that wasn't in English, or the one time where I forced my friends to eat this Indian dessert to prove to my mother that they would like it, and by the way, she was totally right, they did not like it. And only served to strengthen my awareness of how mutually exclusive these 2 worlds really were for me. And at the time when I started becoming interested in music, when I was about 8 or 9 years old, I actually didn't even realize that Indian classical music was a thing. Most people I knew studied maybe guitar, violin, piano, and I studied all those things, and I loved them, I enjoyed them. And I eventually settled on piano as my main instrument and composition as my main medium of expression. So I did what most young musicians do. I practiced for many hours a day over many years. I put in my Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours, and I started carving out my path as a Western classical musician. And in fact, it wasn't until I had been a musician for about 10 years, in my senior year as an undergrad at Juilliard, when I first met an Indian classical musician. So she was a friend of my parents, and in the first conversation I had with her, my universe just cracked open because I realized that here was this person who not only, shared my love and passion and devotion to music, but also shared this culture that up until that point I had really only shared with my own family. So it was kind of like I discovered someone who spoke the secret language that I thought that only I knew. So it took me about 5 years after that meeting to finally start studying Hindustani music formally. But as I began to delve into it, I realized something really curious, which was that some of my things that I felt that were my greatest weaknesses in Western classical music were actually huge sources of strength for me in Hindustani music. So for example, it took me a long time to master what we call sight reading, reading music off a page. And it had always felt a little bit counterintuitive to me, but it's a skill that's prized in the West, and I struggled hard to learn it. But then I realized that actually it was my musical ear and my ability to hear and repeat melodies was actually very valuable to me in Hindustani music. And I realized that harmony, which I had always struggled with the place of and the role of in my own music, didn't really exist as such in Hindustani music. And that Indian music took melody, which had always really meant a lot to me in my music, to levels of nuance that I just never thought were possible. And also I realized that my voice, which by Western standards sounds a little bit nasal and unsupported, was actually the perfect starting place for singing Hindustani music. So for a while there I was a little discouraged, and I wondered, why didn't I just study Indian music from the beginning? But then I realized that there were easily just as many things that I loved about Western music and then felt just as intuitive and natural to me. I love that in Western music you can overlay melodies with one another and counterpoints so that they respond and converse with one another, or that you can create these elaborate textures and timbres through the use of orchestration. And those were some of the things that had really drawn me into Western music in the first place and had captivated me for so many years. So I thought the solution isn't just to pick one or maybe to do them both separately or pursue them separately, but to pick all the things that felt intuitive and natural to me out of both those cultures and create my own hybrid language that gave me the fullest possible range of expression. So if we could play the video. Thank you. So during the year I spent living in India, I found it really interesting that whenever I would, talk to a street vendor or a rickshaw driver, or when I was haggling for something in the market in Hindi, I realized that the people I interacted with weren't really talking to, me, the Reena who grew up in Los Angeles and went to Yale and was a composer. I realized that they were talking to the person that they thought I was, right? Who was the Reena who maybe existed in this parallel universe, who grew up in a middle-class Indian family in a good neighborhood in South Delhi. And the thing is, because they had this alternate perception of me, and because they held up these different mirrors for me to look at myself in, suddenly that other Reena that they thought that I was actually started to emerge from me to meet their expectations. And my personality traits, my gestures, even these thoughts and feelings that I never thought I would have were suddenly kind of drawn out from me and were strengthened at every possible turn. And the same kind of thing happened to me musically as well. When I sat with my Indian teachers, it was clear that they didn't perceive me as a Westerner who was maybe dabbling a little bit in Indian music. They perceived me as an Indian who had finally found her own musical culture. And there was really never any doubt in any of their minds that I would be able to hear and repeat these complex melodic phrases that they would say to me, even when I myself truly doubted my ability to do it. And so to them, Indian music was just hardwired into my bones, and it was inevitable that if I just searched in the right places, I would find it within myself. And whether there was actually any truth to that or not, or whether it was just their perception of me that gave me the confidence to make it so, a whole different musical personality did begin to emerge from me because of it. And so, in those last weeks before my Fulbright year ended and I had to return to the States, I felt this really, really deep sense of despair because I was so afraid of how my life would be when I returned to the US. I was afraid because I identified so closely with these two cultures that were on opposite sides of the world that I would never again be able to be in a place that contained every single thing that I loved. And that wherever I was, I would always be missing the part of it that wasn't there. And I was even more afraid that I would start to lose all these new facets of myself that had finally been acknowledged and developed in India, and that those traits and those ways of being had no mirrors in my American life and would slowly kind of fade away like a language when you have no one to speak to. So after weeks of searching for some answer that would, give me the strength to get back on the plane, I finally realized that it was this. It was that while I might not ever be able to live in a physical world that contained everything that I loved, and allowed me to be the fullest possible version of myself, I could at least try my best to create that world in the music that I wrote. And maybe, it could go further than that. Maybe I could use my music as a vehicle to draw together some of the best Western and Indian musicians that I knew, and then create a space that allowed them to communicate using their own musical language, but yet still be able to understand one another. And maybe the things they would see in one another, maybe the mirrors that they would hold up to one another, would be able to draw out new facets of their musicianship in the same way that looking at these two types of music through the lens of one another had done for me. And maybe if I could facilitate that, then this universe that I had created in my music, once it was realized by musicians and then shared with an audience, it could begin to find its way into the real material world. And so I'm still really at the beginning stages of this journey, and I might always be at the beginning stages of this journey, but every time I create something, I feel like I'm taking one step forward towards rendering a tiny little part of that universe. So maybe next time I get on a train in India, if I sit down next to people I don't know and my turn comes in Antakshari, I'll be able to chime in without a second thought. Mera juta hai Japani, ye patloon Englishstani, sar pe lal to pirusi, aur bhi dil hai Hindustani. My shoes are Japanese, these pants are British, I'm wearing a red Russian hat, and my heart is Indian. Thank you.